groups of indigenous people have been affected by various types of globalization. In an effort to create new efforts to reverse a negative process of globalization on indigenous peoples, the International Forum on Globalization's Indigenous Peoples and Globalization program composed a map showing negative impacts of economic globalization. The map shows over 5,000 distinct indigenous groups that exist today that are all eager to preserve their ancestral lands, sovereignty, government and economic systems, as well as their cultural and spiritual practices. Their biggest fight today is against global corporations that are eager to gain access to the resources these groups of people depend on to sustain their way of life. The exploitation of minerals, forests, oil, fish, and other wildlife, as well as the development of large infrastructures like dams, roads, and ports have displaced these groups of people. Such projects have been either financed or encouraged by organizations such as the World Bank, World Trade Organization, or other development or credit agencies and banks. This is all an attempt to support the global trade and development interests of these global corporations. The mass media, non-governmental organizations, and even the governments and agencies mandated to protect these people and resources have paid little attention to indigenous peoples' efforts to defend themselves against globalization.
In Rio de Janeiro, the indigenous people united, risking their lives for one last desperate stand against the construction of an enormous dam that poses a risk to their lands in the Amazon. After meeting with leaders of 13 tribes the previous month, the chief of the Herrera tribe, Jose Carlos Herrera, proclaims, "This will be our last cry for help. We are not here to kill. We are here to defend our rights." Although victory appeared to be in sight when a federal judge in Pará state halted the construction of the third largest dam by stating the project could cause irreparable harm to indigenous peoples, by Friday the dam was again an option after being overturned by a judge in the capital. The Brazilian judge found that there is no imminent danger for the indigenous community, since the auction did not suggest that there would be immediate construction of the dam, but rather it would be a process of stages. This is an example of the government's shameless efforts to meet the energy needs of faraway cities at the expense of indigenous territories. The new dam would displace 20,000 people, many from indigenous communities. In 1988, Brazil ratified its constitution to grant protection to indigenous people upon the initiation of this project. Judge Antonio Carlos de Almeida Campelo ruled that a law must be passed to change the limitations on dam building that affects indigenous communities. The drying of the Xingu River would change the lives of these indigenous people drastically. At their meeting, they made a decision to create a new tribe of 2,500 people. They would station this tribe directly on the construction site and occupy it for years to come if need be. The chief said, "If we lose this river, we will have no idea what will happen to us. The river provides us with fish and food. How will we eat if we no longer have fish? And how will we live here if we no longer have a river to travel on?" This displacement and destruction of these people's land will force them to change their life and culture from the traditions and ways they have grown accustomed to.
In Peru, the recent conflict in the Peruvian Amazon is only just one violent symptom in an ongoing Cold War, which has waged by President Alan Garcia and his Aparista party against the indigenous groups. Through both racist propaganda and violent repression, they have tried to disarticulate indigenous power. Most of the government propaganda is focused on pushing a free market economic development model. Garcia had issued decrees required by the U.S.-Peru Free Trade Agreement in order to open the Amazon to exploration and exploitation of its natural resources. Studies show projects to negotiate blocks covering up to 72% of Peru's Amazon with oil and gas companies. Garcia's plan backfired amid the government's response to opposition and its violence against indigenous protesters. About 92% of Peruvians support the indigenous cause against the Amazon decree. Luckily, most of Garcia's decrees were replaced. However, the government still continues conflict against Peru's indigenous groups. One of Garcia's main tactics was to compare indigenous groups with Hugo Chavez and Evo Morales. Garcia recently states, "Peru is living a cold war against foreign leaders." Before the violence broke out in the Amazon, the real war was the one being waged by Garcia against Peru's indigenous people. Even with all this intense opposition, Garcia intends to proceed with his unpopular agenda. Prior to the implementation of the FTA with the United States, Garcia blamed his opponents, mainly the indigenous, for standing in the way of Peru's development via foreign capital. Now that Peru's Congress ratified the FTA, Garcia has twice faced off against Amazon indigenous groups over the natural resources and their territories. These two events were an attempt to compare the indigenous protests to the armed group that terrorized Peru for so many years.
Governmental pressure continues to occur in areas in South America as they oppose the various victories made by their indigenous movements. Pablo de Avalos, treasurer of the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, claims that for the 3 major victories they have achieved, they have taken 3 huge losses as well. The new relationship between social movements and the state, which are consequences of the progressive and leftist government's emergence, consider the indigenous people to be a threat that need to be fought and neutralized. The empire has claimed the indigenous people to be one of the largest problems affecting governance in the area. As supporters of this claim, the World Bank and other international organizations have started providing financial aid to projects that stop the creation of joint indigenous actors. In 2006, the uprising of the indigenous people of Ecuador against the government's intentions to sign a free trade agreement with the United States was the first large indigenous mobilization following a long period of crisis. After their first major uprising, it became clear that the indigenous movement was the key to Ecuador's governance. Since then, several projects have been launched to eliminate the indigenous organization. Chimborazo was the center of indigenous resistance during the 1990s and became the object of political intervention of projects that altered the indigenous peoples into an economically poor status. These projects have created secondary organizations that compete over the same resources. The combat of the indigenous movement shows the level organizations are willing to go to in order to further globalization by maintaining political power in an area.
There seems to be hope for this movement of indigenous people. The Prime Minister of Australia read an apology on February 13, 2008 to the federal parliament for the acts of his predecessors in facilitating and employing the Stolen Generations policy. The policy was sanctioned from 1909 to 1969 and involved the removal of indigenous children from their families as non-indigenous settlers laid claim to the area. This apology paves way for the incorporation of indigenous populations in the wealth of Australia. The ex-chairman of the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, Patrick Dotson, said, "After this moment, Australia can be imagined as a different place, a place where Aboriginal citizens no longer live in third-world conditions." However, this apology is only a step forward. Further progress still poses a challenge. The most important issue for Indigenous people of Australia is the ownership of land. As poverty plagues their communities, their lifespan is significantly shortened, they experience higher child mortality rates, are more likely to be unemployed, and are at risk 12 times higher for infectious disease. This land is crucial to the indigenous population for preservation of their social and cultural identity, as it can provide this group of people with the resources and space they need to promote and develop their culture and way of life. For the indigenous peoples of Australia, the land is said to have served as the source of social, spiritual, and legal arrangements. Today, if indigenous groups want to progress, they must deal with the alien political and economic systems that has been established. If the ways and culture of indigenous groups around the globe are not recognized and incorporated into the region's priorities, some of the world's oldest cultures will begin to disappear. As they continue to fight for their survival, the persecution they experience from governmental and non-governmental agencies is taking its toll on their efforts.